My name's Michael Osborn, and I'm a haematologist and oncologist at the Women's and Children's Hospital in Adelaide. And I also look after the youth cancer service for teenagers and young adults at the Royal Adelaide Hospital in South Australia. There are a number of clinical trials focusing on relapse in ALL, but what is available for you will at least partly depend on which country you live in. Some clinical trials are run by groups of cancer clinicians who collaborate together, such as the Children's Oncology Group in the USA or the IBFM group in Europe. These trials are often run across a number of countries. Other clinical trials are run by pharmaceutical companies, and these are often run over several countries as well. While other clinical trials might be run at only one site or a small number of sites. So, which ALL relapse trials are available will very much depend on where you live. The other thing to remember is that there are different types of ALL. Most of you would be familiar with the concept of BALL and TALL, and some clinical trials are only for BALL, whereas others might be only for TALL, and then there's some clinical trials that are for both. Most of the relapsed ALL studies are focusing on new drugs or cellular therapies. For example, currently in Europe, the IBFM group have a trial for relapsed childhood ALL. This trial is combining inotuzumab with chemotherapy. Now, we know from earlier clinical trials that inotuzumab by itself is effective in a proportion of patients who relapse, but we're wondering whether it's better if it's given together with a chemotherapy regimen. In particular, the IBFM group are asking whether inotuzumab or conventional induction therapy is the best initial treatment in relapsed ALL, and then after that, all of the patients on this trial go on to get more chemotherapy plus or minus transplant. Now, this study is only for people who've got BALL because inotuzumab's only effective in BALL, but the IBFM group are planning on opening a study in TALL in the near future as well. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the USA, St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital has a clinical trial adding two new drugs called venetoclax and navitoclax into a relapsed ALL chemotherapy regimen. This is a really interesting study, which was prompted by some impressive results with these two drugs in a small study of patients who had relapsed multiple times. This study is for both B and TALL, and St Jude are planning on opening it at a number of sites within the USA, apart from just their hospital, and hopefully in Australia and New Zealand as well. Then, of course, there's a number of studies of newer and hopefully more effective CAR T cells and other cellular therapies, as well as some other novel agents too. I believe that we're really only at the beginning of discovering the potential of CAR T cells in treating cancer, and I can guarantee that there'll be a lot more clinical trials involving CAR T cells and other cellular therapies. We all know that the initial CAR T cell studies have shown quite impressive results in ALL patients who didn't have any other treatment options, but there were still some patients who relapsed. So, leukemia scientists have been busy trying to understand why this is, and then to use that knowledge to develop newer CAR T cells to try and overcome those problems. For example, the initial CAR T cells in ALL hunted down leukemia cells which had a protein called CD19 on their surface. One problem is that occasionally ALLs don't have CD19 on them. So one approach is to develop a CAR T cell targeting a different protein on the leukemia cell surface, such as one called CD22. A bigger problem with some of the earlier CAR T cells is that the leukemic cell would start off having the CD19 target on the surface, but then after a while it would lose that CD19 and hence become resistant to CAR T cells. So a strategy here is to develop a newer CAR T cell which can target two proteins on the ALL surface, usually both CD19 and CD22. That way, if the leukemia loses one of these surface proteins, it will hopefully still have the other surface marker which the CAR T cell can act against. So it's kind of like attacking the cell from two different directions. Another problem with CAR T cells is that sometimes the T cells either become exhausted or don't last as long as we would like them to. So other trials are looking at adding in other medications or making other modifications to the CAR T cells to try and overcome this problem. A big issue with the initial CAR T cells is that they take at least a few weeks to manufacture. And sadly, there were some patients whose leukemia progressed before they could get their CAR T cells. So, with this in mind, we need to come up with a faster strategy. So, to do this, some clinical trials are not using the patient's own cells to make CAR T cells, but instead are trying to make CARs with somebody else's cells, sometimes using a type of cell called an NK cell to build a similar cellular therapy. This way, we'll hopefully be able to get cellular therapies to patients faster. The other really big problem is that CAR T cells are currently very expensive. And while this is clearly a problem in high income countries, it's a massive problem in poorer countries who often can't afford these at all. So, another really important research question is working out how we can make CAR T cells that are cheaper but still just as effective, so that hopefully more and more people with relapsed ALL will be able to access these. So there are a number of novel agents that are currently being investigated for ALL, and these are at various stages of development. Some of them are still being trialed on cell lines or in laboratories, whereas some of the other novel agents have reached what we would call a phase one study. A phase one study is all about trying to work out the best dose of a medication and also trying to work out what side effects the medication has. Following that, a new agent will go into phase two and phase three and sometimes phase four studies, which is when we are looking at the effectiveness of that medication and then comparing it against other treatment strategies. So, with regards to the novel agents, some of them are still being tested in the lab, others are in phase one studies, and others are reaching phase two studies and beyond. One of the particularly interesting novel agents is one called revumenib. But before I talk about that, I should again mention that we need to remember that there's many different subtypes of ALL. I've already mentioned that there's B-ALL and T-ALL, but even amongst B-ALL, we know that there's more than 20 different subtypes of B-ALL, and T-ALL also has many subtypes too. So, a number of the newer novel agents are not necessarily being developed for all types of ALL, but rather are focusing on some of these specific subtypes. And revumenib is one of these. So, revumenib is a drug which is specifically targeting a type of B-ALL called KMT2A-rearranged ALL. Revumenib is a new small molecule which looks like it's potentially might be quite effective for this particular subtype of ALL. The reason why this is so exciting is that KMT2A rearranged ALL has historically had more concerning prognosis in that more patients with that subtype of ALL tended to relapse. So, as an ALL doctor, I think it's really exciting to think that we might have a new drug that will be effective against this particularly serious subtype of ALL. One of the other interesting novel agents in ALL is one called venetoclax. This is a drug which has been found to be effective in a number of different blood cancers, including chronic lymphocytic leukemia and more recently acute myeloid leukemia. And there's now a developing body of evidence to suggest that it may have a role in ALL as well. This particular drug works differently to a lot of traditional chemotherapy agents. In particular, we know that in cancer, and that includes leukemia as well, that one of the problems is that the cancer cells live for much longer than what a normal cell would live for. What venetoclax does is it comes along and prevents that cell from living for so long. In particular, it works on a pathway called apoptosis, which is a fancy way of saying programmed cell death. So normal cells don't last forever, and sometimes they'll switch off. And what venetoclax does is it comes and restores that program so that the cancer cell is not lasting for as long as it normally might do. So adding that to conventional chemotherapy can result in the chemotherapy being much more effective. So venetoclax is being used together with chemotherapy in several clinical trials, and I think this is going to be very interesting to see how this goes. I guess the important thing to remember with any of these novel agents is that each of them may potentially have side effects. And one of the important things to look at in all of the clinical trials is what are the side effects of these medications, and does the benefit outweigh the side effect? For instance, sometimes a drug might look particularly promising, but when we add it to chemotherapy, we might discover that it doesn't necessarily improve things further than they already are. Or it might bring in additional side effects that um, make it less feasible for ongoing use. So I think these two particular drugs do look very, very exciting, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of the clinical trials that are investigating those. In my experience, hematologists and oncologists will usually bring up the topic of clinical trials if there's one available for a patient. So my first piece of advice is to be open to hearing about and considering a clinical trial if your doctor raises the topic. My second piece of advice is don't be shy about asking your doctor whether there's a clinical trial that could be available for you. For various reasons, we don't always have a clinical trial available for every cancer type all of the time, but if we do, this is a good way to potentially access a new treatment. Some new treatments in clinical trials are found to be very effective and go on to become a standard part of treatment, while some others don't end up being so effective, or they might have serious side effects that limit their use. And this then tells us that it wouldn't necessarily be wise to incorporate those drugs into standard treatment. But whatever the outcome, it's important to remember that the main reason why we've seen such advances in the treatment of ALL and other cancers is because of what we've learnt in clinical trials. In other words, irrespective of whether a clinical trial drug helps a specific individual, what we learn from that clinical trial today will help future patients get better and better treatments. So I'd certainly advise you to consider a clinical trial if it's offered, and if it isn't, then ask whether a clinical trial is available. Another point is that not all clinical trials are necessarily testing new anti-cancer medicines. There are some clinical trials that are testing supportive care medication or other interventions to help people cope better with cancer treatment or stay well during their treatment. For example, our group has run a couple of clinical trials on exercise in cancer, and I've also been involved in a clinical trial of online psychological interventions. Another example of this sort of clinical trial from the UK was one called the Bright Light Study that was run by Teenage Cancer Trust. This provided a lot of information on how best to structure healthcare services for teenagers and young adults with cancer. From a patient's perspective, the learnings from clinical trials like this can have a huge impact on quality of life as well as well-being. Usually these types of trials will be offered through the hospital, but occasionally they might be run by patient support organisations too. Going back to the question of how can patients get involved in clinical trials, increasingly researchers are wanting patients and the public to help with the design and conduct of research and spreading the news about research as well. This is because as researchers, we realise that involving patients and the public help us to develop the research questions that are most relevant to patients. It also helps us design studies that will be acceptable to patients rather than including a whole pile of onerous or unnecessary components. Public involvement also helps ensure that information sheets are understandable when doctors are trying to explain a clinical trial to a patient. There's also some evolving evidence that involving previous patients or members of the public in the design of studies helps the trial participants to have a better experience when they're on the study. They can also help communicate the results at the end of the study as well, in a way that anyone can understand, irrespective of their knowledge of the medical field. In the UK, this concept is called patient and public involvement, whereas in Europe and the USA, it's often described as patient engagement, or in Australia, we'd call it consumer engagement. But whatever we call it, this patient and public involvement helps ensure that research is done together with patients rather than research being done to, about, or for them. In the UK, I know that the NHS, the MRC, and CRUK, and others are really strong advocates for involving patients in research design and conduct, and so are similar groups in other countries. So, if you're really interested in getting involved in clinical trials, being part of patient and public involvement is a great way to get involved. Once again, ask your doctor if there's opportunities for this kind of thing, and if they don't know, don't be afraid to ask them if they can find out for you.